Now we're on the top of Daf Yudalid Omid Beis. The Amrit Katan Ispe Plugta. If you're assuming, as Shmuel assumes, that whether or not you're allowed to cut the hair of the child, the newborn babe, on Chol Moed would depend upon whether the baby was born on Erev Yontif or on Yontif itself, then we have to have an exact parallel in Avelus. And we're going to have to say that if the child is born in Avelus, during the Avelus, then we're going to allow cutting the hair. But if the child is born on Erev Yontif, before the Avelus, then we're not going to allow you to cut your hair. Nim says Avelus no heges b'katon. So the Gemara is now assuming, within the context of this equation in the Bryce of Rabbi Pinchas between Chol Moed and Avelus, that if the baby is born before Chol Moed, you're not allowed to cut its hair on Chol Moed, and by parallel, if a baby was born before its parent, See, this is what you call a Gavra Shem Awful. Let me try to explain. It's a very, very new, very revolutionary. What happens is that immediately after the birth of this baby, its parent died. Never. Rachmana litzlan. Now, what does it mean that the baby's hair can't be covered because its parent died? A baby cannot firtzach, can't be noeg avelus. But there's something called a gavra shem oven. And a gavra shem oven applies to a katan as well. So if a child never loses a parent, that child is an avelus. So the Gemara asks, are you telling me that there's avelus regarding a child who lost a parent, and therefore we cannot cut the hair of the child? But Sanya, we have a brisa that says, Mekaren lekot mipnei agmas nefesh. That if a katan loses a parent, then will render its clothing as a sign of grief. And this is called kavod hames. And I think what the Gemara is saying, give me a second here, I'm sorry. Let me just see if he has a note on this. The Amrit Katan Islay Pluk Tieshkil Bazem Noah Lefnei Regel Osel Galchabim came Katan Anoah Lefnei Yemei Evlo Hainalacha Shenolad Mes Echami Krovov Ye Osel Galcho is Nimtes Omer Avelus No Heges Bekatan Vatanya, and yet we learn in a brisa that ain't Avelus No Heges Bekatan. How? Because Mekaren Lekatan. Yeah, this is what I was looking for. Umashma Sharak mitam ze mekaren lekata. Notice we're not dealing with avelus, we're dealing with what's called agmas nefesh and kavod hames. Avalom mitnei chovas hakatan ba'avelus. So this concept of a gavra shem ovel, with regard to a katan, is not Correct. There's no Gavar Shem Ovel with regard to a Katan. There's only Agmas Nefesh. Is Kevan She'ein Dine Avelus Noagim B'Katan Madui Asul Galech B'Mei Evlam. Right? We understood that whenever there's an Iser Giluach in Chol Moed, then it's mirror image parallel Iser in Avelus, and that's the case of a Katan. Right? Because Shmuel applied the Iser Giluach of Chol Moed to the case of a Katan. Right? He was trying to deal with whether or not we're allowed to cut the hair on the Katan after he's born. And he said no. I mean, if the Katan was born on Erev the Moed. So that distinction between the Katan being born Erev Moed and on the Moed, whereas in the first case it's also Giluach, in the second case it's Mutter, that distinction has to have a parallel in the case of Avelus, which would mean that a Katan whose parent died, there should be an Iser Giluach. And that's not true. Amar Ravashi, no, Miktani Asurim, Dilma Yeshlem Asur, Yeshlem Mutter. You're reading the Brisa in the wrong way. You're reading the Brisa as if it says that when those who are Surim during Chol Moed are Asurim during Avelus. That's not what it says. All the Brisas tell you that when it's a heter and a leniency that allows you to cut the hair in Chol Moed, that has its parallel leniency in Avelus. So when Avel gets off the ship or he, gets out of jail, he's allowed to cut his hair during Avelus. He says in the note here, Shmuel cannot be challenged on the strength of such an inference from the Brisa. The Brisa does not explicitly say that those who are forbidden to cut their hair in Moed are forbidden to cut their hair in Avelus. The Brisa only teaches that those who are permitted to cut their hair during Chol Moed may also do so during the morning. Now we have another Lishna of Shmuel. Just the flip side. They have Amar Shmuel, Katan mutal legalcha b'moed, that you're allowed to cut the hair of a newborn baby during Chol Moed, lo shna nolad b'moed, lo shna nolad b'ikara, whether or not he was born on Erev Yontif or he's born on Yontif. Amar Pinchas hafanan nami tnina, and now Rav Pinchas has a Bryce, the same Bryce that we had before, but now it becomes a support text for Shmuel. Called Elu Sha'omer Mutal Legalech B'Moed, Mutal Legalech B'Mei Evlo. Ha'asurim Legalech B'Moed, Asurim Legalech B'Mei Evlo. Iyamrit Katan Asur, Nimtzeis Avelus Noheges B'Katan. Utnaya, and we have a Bryce that says Mekaran Lekatan B'Bnei Agmas Nefesh. So there is no Avelus in the case of a Katan who lost a parent is not an Ovel. It's only a din of Agmas Nefesh and Kvod Mes. So how do we reconcile these two prices? We have to assume that in the case of a Nolad, a Katan Shenolad, you're allowed to cut the hair on Chol Moed, and it doesn't matter one way or the other, whether it was born on Erev Yontif or born on Yontif. Ravashi, again, the Shlug of Ravashi, Miktani Ha'asurim. The Brisa doesn't have a complete equation in both Iser and Heter. Dilma Yeshem Asur, Yeshem Mutter. The equation is only in one direction. And that means that there are certain cases where you're not allowed to cut the hair during Chol Moed, and you're not allowed to cut the hair during Avelus. But there are also situations in which it's mutter, even though on Chol Moed it would be also it's mutter in Avelus, which would be exactly free. In other words, we've now cut the umbilical cord and we haven't supported Shmuel's statement from this Brisa of Rabbi Pinchas. Now is a very, very important sugi. when there's a conflict between Avelus and Regel, then the mitzvah of Simchas HaRegel trumps the Isra Avelus. So Avelus is suspended during the Regel. Again, we have to know what about Dvarim Shebitzina, but that will depend upon the next part of this Gemara. Avelus to make Kara, who, let's say, he was already an Avel, and now Yontiv happened, is then Asi Ese Derabim V'Dachi Ese D'Yachid. Because Simcha on Yontiv is public, therefore it has a special status, upgraded status vis-a-vis Avelus, which is only an Ese D'Yachid. It's only an individual essay, and the Simcha Sarabim of Samach B'Chagecha trumps the Ese D'Yachid. And here we have the famous Ramban. Ramban says if it's only because of the public nature of Simcha, then on a private basis, we have an Esei D'Yachid. You know, it's what I do behind my closed doors as far as V'samach. There's only my private individual observance. And now I have an Chas Shalom, an Avelus. So then we have what's called Dvarim Shebitzina. And according to the Ramban, Dvarim Shebitzina, Noagim Ve'Avelus. But that's a case where the Avelus began before Yontif. Then the Avelus Tahashta, who now, let's say, he loses Nebuch, one of his close relatives, on Yontif itself, and now he's Chayav in Avelus. Lo Asi Avelus D'Yachid V'Dachi Ese Derabim. So the Ramban wants to suggest that in this case, he should be Noeg Dvarim Shebitzina. If he had Avelus Meikara before Yontif, then the Yontif could undermine the Avelus and completely be Mevatel. But in the case where he had his Avelus on Yontif, it's not that the Yontif is completely undermine and vitiate the Avelus. The Avelus will be postponed until after Yontif. Menuda ma'oshi niduya berega. The law of a nidui, of a nuda, is identical to the law of Isur Malacha of the Isurim of Avel. So what happens if there's a conflict now between Niug Nidui and Niug Simchas Yontif? So the Ritva explains the Saf, which I don't see here. Just 1 second. Maushiyino Niduyo Beregel. Okay, I don't see the Ritva here right now, but what I remember from my younger years is that the Ritva claims that there's a fundamental difference between Avelus and Nidui, even though all the dinim of Nid Avelus apply during Nidui, but it's a fundamental difference. In the case of Avelus, it's because of his inner state of Avelus. He's emotionally in grief and mourning, and that has to be totally antithetical to Simchas Yontif. So that any Nid Avelus is an expression of Avelus Shebalev, which is contradictory and antithetical to Simcha Shebalev. But in the case of Nidui, he's knowing Nidui, but he doesn't have any Nidui Shebalev. And therefore the Gemara thinks that maybe he should be knowing his Nidui even during the Regel, and that doesn't undermine the mitzvah of Simcha, because in his Lev he could be B'Sameach, and he has to be B'Sameach because of B'Samach B'Chagef, even though on the outside he's knowing his Nidui. Of Rav Yosef Toshma, we have a brisa that says, Donim, Dini Nefashos, Dini Makis, with Dini Mamonos, all this can be judged on Chol Moed. The Elot Sayis Lidina, and if somebody subpoenas someone to come to court and the defendant refuses to come to court, we put him into Nidu. He says, Rav Yosef, Isal Kedaitach, Eino Noeg Niduya Beregel. If you're going to say that Regel completely trumps and undermines Nidui, is Mishumas V'Asi Meikara, Asi Regel Dochile. That if in the case that he was put into a Nidui before Yontiv, you're going to tell me now that Eino Noig Niduya Beregel, because Regel is Doche Nidui, is Hashta Meshamtina Le'anan, right? The Brisa is talking about specifically Chol HaMoed, and it's telling us that if he refuses to show up, we put him into Nidui. Is Hashta Meshamtina Le'anan? We're going to put him into Nidui during Chol HaMoed? You just told me that if he was in Nidui, then the Regel undermines Nidui. How much more so we cannot put him into Nidui when it's already the Regel, which is the case of the Brisa. Amalei Abai rejects it. Dilma la'ayune b'dinei. What the Brisa has in mind when it says that we take all these dinim and we keilu judge them in Bezdin on Chol HaMoed, it doesn't mean that we actually do the adjudication on Yontif on Chol HaMoed. It's only a permission to be ma'ayin into the case, to investigate and study the case, even to come to a decision. But to hand down a Gemar Din, that has to be postponed until after the Yontif, after the Regel. Now, what was the Havamina here that you would not be allowed to be ma'ayin? That I'm not sure. Let me just see once again if he has anything. Liyune bedina, li'ayin bedina. Achlo lo mares kmar din hochenami. Mashashanina bebraises shedonim dini momenos. Ein ze el liyune bedine, she'aino bedino. He doesn't explain what the Hava means. Omnam lo yifsiku es adin. V'yomru l'nidonim mi zakoi michai me'ato. Ein lanu l'dadek me'abraisa iminadin oso b'moed olah. So the Brisa is not addressing the question of whether we put him into a nidui on road. We're only talking about a yune b'dine. And now Abai proves it. The ilo teimahachi, if you don't accept my pshat that we're only talking about iyune b'dine, is dina fashis the ketani. What does it mean that they adjudicate capital cases on Chol HaMoed? Achinami de katalin le? Are we going to execute a person who's found guilty? 23. He says in capital cases, the court announces its decision and then simply executes it. Right? We don't give it any time. There's no time delay here. Thus, the Brisa would seem to mean that the courts are permitted to hand down verdicts on Chol HaMoed, and in capital cases, they would perform executions on as well. And the Gemara asks, "Vaha kamimne misimchas yantiv." And why is that? The Sanya we learned to the Brisa, Rabbi Kiva Omer, minayin l'sanhedrin shehargu es hanefesh she'ein ta'amim also kol yom. That on the day that they execute a condemned person, the Bezdin is enjoined from eating anything the entire day. There's a famous lav shebechlolos. So now we're excluding and prohibiting achila and shasi on the part of the judges, and that we're not going to do. So you can't tell me that they're handing down a verdict on Yontif, because handing down a verdict in a case of din nefashos would imply that we have to put him to death without delay. And then the judges are now, we're undermining their simchas Yontif because they're not allowed to be told him anything the entire day. Lo sofa adam. Ella liyune b'dine. We're only talking about studying the case. Achinami liyune b'dine, and in dine moment is also talking about liyune b'dine. So you cannot derive any conclusions from this brisa about putting someone into nidui if he refuses to show up in court on Chol HaMoed. And Rav Yosef is now going to defend himself against Abai's objection. Amalei imkain if you're telling me that with regard to Dinei Nefoshel, some Moed, they come to Iyune B'Dinei, they come to a conclusion in their minds, the judges. They don't announce it and hand down a Gemar Din. Now there's a violation of the Isser of Inui Hadin, which is based on a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim. Yutes, shenemar v'ahavta l'recha k'kamoch. That's what was missing here in my Gemara. Ella, the Brisa certainly means that they do announce their Gemar Din, and they will put the condemned criminal to death on Chol Moed. You're telling me now the judges will now be enjoined from Achil and Shasiya and not be able to Mekayim Simchas Yontiv. Also, mitzafru me'ani b'dinei. They'll study the case in the morning. They'll go ahead and fulfill the mitzvah of Simchas Yontiv, eating and drinking during the entire day. And then before the sun sets, they give a Gemar Din. They've already made the decision in the morning, but there wasn't a Gemar Din. By postponing the Gemar Din, they could be Mekayim the mitzvah of Simchas Yontiv during the course of the day. Amar Abaye Toshma, what are you going to do with our Mishnah? Menuda sheitiru lo chachamim. Is Elu Megalchin b'Moed. The Mishnah says Menuda sheitiru lo chachamim, which means that on the regular, the Chacham Matir, every Menuda, it's because, why would they Matir the Nidui? Because there's no Nidui during the regular. You're reading it as if it says the Chachamim allowed him to be released from his state of Nidui. It happened to be a case that they released him on the Moed. The Azal Paisei Lebaldine, he was put into a Nidui because of some altercation between him and a Tovea, and now he made up with him. He appeased him. And they were martyrs. I'd say here we got up to the Mitzorah, which we'll try to finish up a little bit later on today. Mitzorah. We're about 10 lines down, 10 lines up before the end of Daf Yudalid Amid. Let me wish you a great day.